pain. And because we're talking about trauma-informed language and interviewing, we're going to start off with a bit of an introduction on trauma. That will be very much of an introduction. There won't be too much information. And then some information on trauma-informed care and language, what that looks like. Again, an introduction. We'll take about a 15-minute break after that piece, and then jump into the interviewing skills piece. And then we'll talk about confidentiality and limitations. And lastly, documentation do's and don'ts. And if you go onto the site, or if you watch the video later, maybe during the question piece, we'll have the resource page up, but you'll be able to see it with the slides as well, just in case you're interested in getting more resources. Okay, so trauma. Trauma comes from the Greek word wound. So essentially what trauma is referring to is a wound. As we know, there are all sorts of ways that people can be wounded, and I'm sure when you're working with individuals, you've heard a lot of stories, and a lot of stories have been shared around different ways that individuals do feel wounded. What it is about trauma is that it continues to cause pain. So this is a wound that goes unhealed. Gabor Mate, who is a very prominent Canadian author, physician, an expert on trauma, addictions, and homelessness, and he talks a lot about trauma. And if you get a chance to read any of his work or watch, I believe it's called The Wisdom of Truth. It's fascinating. So he says life brings pain, but pain is not the same as trauma. Pain becomes traumatic when that pain isn't resolved, when it doesn't get the support it needs, when it isn't metabolized, when we don't learn and grow from it. So when we're thinking of pain versus trauma, what we're thinking of is trauma is something that, again, goes unhealed, unresolved, something that we don't learn from and don't have the opportunity to grow from. And that's what makes the painful experience a traumatic one. Another piece to trauma is that it's a lasting emotional response, and it stems from some sort of a distressing event that will be unique to the individual. Trauma is a very unique experience. So, for example, one person might have a distressing event and not feel have a traumatic event from that, whereas someone else might experience trauma from that same distressing event. So again, it is really about pain that goes unresolved and unhealed that stems from a distressing event of some kind. It can harm a person's sense of safety, a sense of self, and ability to regulate emotions and navigate relationships. This piece is important, and you might find that, for example, when working with an individual, there could be outbursts of anger or sadness or withdrawal, confusion. Those are all very normal responses to trauma, and that's what it's referring to when it says an ability to regulate emotions. So sometimes those outbursts of anger or confusion or sadness, or someone withdrawing, can be a very, very normal, typical, common, expected response from someone who's experienced trauma. Trauma responses, so how we respond to trauma, is first developed in childhood and impacts how the brain develops. And so I'm sure people have heard a lot about attachment theory. I'm certainly not an expert in that, but you can look at theories such as attachment theory to get an understanding of how childhood impacts the brain, and experiences in childhood impacts how the brain develops in terms of trauma responses. There's so much that you can also learn about in terms of the brain, how it is impacted from trauma and that. So definitely there's more information on that if you're interested in finding out more. So trauma, in turn, it's a very subjective, emotional, psychological experience of an event. And because it's subjective, again, it's experienced differently and uniquely based on the individual. So people will experience the same event differently and have different responses and reactions to the same event. Intersectionality is also a piece that impacts an individual's experiences and the development of trauma. So trauma intersects in many different ways with culture, history, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, location, language, class, socioeconomic class. These are all pieces of intersectionality. So, for example, a white, able bodied male will have a different experience than, let's say, a indigenous woman will have, or a black male will have, or a black woman will have. And so, you know, it can look very different depending on someone's race, gender, sexual orientation, location, ability, language, etc. And that's really what intersectionality is getting at. And so when we sometimes, we'll hear things about privilege, and that's a piece of what we're talking about when we discuss intersectionality, that idea that certain people have privileges that others don't based on their race, gender, sexual orientation, language, socioeconomic status, so forth. Again, Gabor Mate, he says, trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. And so that's a really big piece and we'll also talk about that in trauma-informed care, in that approach, is that we're looking at what's happened to an individual as opposed to inside of an individual, as opposed to what's happened to them. So as opposed to the event itself, it's about the result of the event and how that's impacted the person. So I know we zoomed right past that piece. I hope that there's no big questions there, but please feel free to have some ready if you have them. But we'll, again, just for the essence of time, that was a very, very basic introduction on trauma. And so now we will shift to trauma-informed care and language. Again, just an introduction on that piece as well. So trauma-informed care and language is about treating the entire person, the whole person. So it's taking into account past trauma and how that would then impact someone's coping mechanisms, behaviors, the way that they develop these coping mechanisms and behaviors. Those will be impacted by trauma. And so trauma-informed care is really taking that into consideration, recognizing it, acknowledging it, and working with somebody with that understanding. And a big piece is that your past trauma will impact your future and your present. So our pasts always impact our future and our present. And so because of that connection, it's really important to understand that the past trauma will impact somebody in their present, and that it really does trauma-informed care is really about treating the whole person and understanding that piece. So trauma-informed care shifts the focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So a similar thinking to what we read with Gabor Mate. So again, switching trauma-informed care is about switching the focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So instead of the individual being the problem, the event is the problem. The result, the impact of the traumatic event is the problem, as opposed to the individual themselves. And so this is really important when we're talking about working with people and supporting people, because the idea is that the individual doesn't need to be fixed. The impact of the trauma is what needs to be resolved. And so I'm just going to put on this video. Hopefully it shares the sound properly. It's just about 3 minutes long. It's not too much, but I'll say no this time. I think that works. I'm just going to, if you can just bear with me for a moment, I am just going to copy and paste it and do it that way.
You
Is the video showing up for people? I've just copied and pasted it instead. Can you see like a blank black screen? Yes, okay, perfect, thank you.
know the old saying, don't judge a book by its cover? Well, the same is true when you assess a patient. Hi, I'm Dr. Cruz. Early in my career, I noticed a pattern with some of my patients. They often had multiple health issues, were uneasy during office visits, and frequently visited the emergency department. But worst of all, they never got better despite multiple visits. Then I realized something. From an early age, many of my patients were exposed to trauma and adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. This includes emotional, sexual, or physical abuse, violence, neglect, discrimination, poverty, and other adverse events. ACEs are more common in the US than you'd think. In fact, 60% of US adults have one ACE, 25% have 3 or more ACEs, and 16% have 4 or more. ACEs occur in all socioeconomic groups, but are more common in low-income and minority populations. For young children, repeated exposure to trauma can impact brain development and literally rewire the brain's response to stress. So as they grow up, many struggle with issues related to emotional regulation, like depression, anxiety, or substance use disorders. Trauma survivors are also more often at risk for chronic diseases, behavioral health problems, and even suicide. Knowing all this, I began to rethink my approach to care. Instead of asking patients, "What's wrong with you?" I ask, "What happened to you?" Recognizing that life experiences are often a root cause of poor health is integral to improving patient care. Trauma-informed care has helped me take these experiences into account, providing greater insight into my patients' needs and how to address them. Here are 5 key ways that healthcare organizations can gradually integrate trauma-informed care into their practices to help patients and staff. First, build awareness and generate buy-in. Involve both staff and patients in adopting a trauma-informed approach. Second, invest in a trauma-informed workforce. Hire staff that embrace trauma-informed care and provide training not only for clinical staff, but also for non-clinical employees like front desk workers or security guards, who are often the face of your organization. Next, create an environment that is safe and welcoming for patients and staff. Engage patients in meaningful ways. Ask how they feel and listen. You can also build trust by involving them in their own treatment planning. Finally, identify and treat trauma. Consider a screening approach that works for your patients and ensure that treatments and referral sources are available. These changes take time, but each step improves our ability to connect with and care for patients. Today, our patients appreciate the changes we've made. Plus, our staff is more in tune with patients, so work is less stressful and more rewarding. Trauma-informed care. It can truly transform the caregiving experience from being treaters to being healers.
Amber, please unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Let me just go back to my screen here. Okay. Are we back to the slide okay? Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm going to try to speak louder. Sorry. Thank you, Heather, for pointing that out. So again, yes, the trauma-informed care shifts the focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. That's really the core piece of what trauma-informed care involves. Trauma-informed care is very much about taking a person-centered approach. And so when we're talking about a person-centered approach, we're talking about recognizing that there are individual differences and needs between people, and that those, again, needs are unique, and that when we're working with individuals, we would use compassion and non-judgment, and recognition that everybody does have unique needs and differences, and a willingness to work with those. So really, it's again about recognizing and accepting that we all have unique needs and differences, with a compassionate, non-judgmental lens. Understanding how to use trauma-informed language is essential when interviewing someone who is struggling with trauma. And this is even not only for the benefit of the individual that you're working with, the client, but for yourself as well, because this can be a very difficult aspect to work with. Working with somebody who's maybe revealing trauma, talking about traumatic stories, sharing trauma, that can be a really difficult position to be in. And so it's really important to understand how to use trauma-informed language if this is an approach that you're interested in an effort to make that experience the best for both your client and for yourself as well. And so one of the other aspects of trauma-informed care is taking a strength-based approach. So strength-based practice is really talking about looking at the person's strengths and focusing on those. So it's a theory that emphasizes self-determination, and it's a philosophy and a way of viewing clients as resourceful and resilient, as opposed to having a deficit. And so oftentimes what has been found is that when we work with individuals and we focus on strengths, and I think we can probably see a lot of this in our own lives, when we focus on the positives, on the things that are working well, then we find that there are better results and people are more likely to move along down that path than if we focus on deficits. And so we find that often focusing on deficits can be somewhat debilitating for people, as opposed to focusing on strengths, which is more empowering, and oftentimes it is what is needed for people to move forward. And maybe I'll move to the questions after, if that's okay. If there's something that's absolutely needed, though, just let me know. Okay. So we do have a break, but I think I'm actually just going to move this if people don't mind, because it's so soon. And I'm going to continue on with the interviewing skills piece. Hopefully that's okay with everybody. Let me just, sorry. Okay. So going into interviewing skills, so this is probably the biggest piece that people will be interested in and using in terms of your work with trauma survivors, and working with a trauma-informed care approach. I'm just curious if, before we get into interviewing skills, and maybe we can just put this in the chat, are there people that have experience working with trauma-informed care, and is this something that has been a benefit? Do people find that there's been a benefit for them in working from a trauma-informed care lens? I'm just curious, kind of, if this is something that is brand new to people, or if people, if this is something that's kind of in people's wheelhouse already in terms of trauma-informed care practice. And no pressure to respond. Okay, so Sue is saying that many of their students have experienced trauma. Read several books on the topic. That's great. Building connections with clients, and that's really a big piece. And we will talk about that, how trauma-informed care language can really help with building rapport and trusting relationships. Mhm. So for some people, it's new to them, but they've worked with people with trauma, experiencing trauma, and I imagine that's a very difficult experience, to be working with people experiencing trauma. Um, and so I would be curious, to know later on, going back, how if that work has changed, or in what ways it's changed when you're taking a trauma-informed lens. Um, Significant trauma in their lives, yeah. And I mean, this might also ring true for some people in terms of their own lives and their own experiences, because just because we're working with individuals with trauma as helping professionals doesn't mean that we also haven't experienced trauma ourselves, or we don't have family members or close loved ones, friends, colleagues who have also experienced trauma. Um, Even in terms of Jeremy, I'm going to have to look up Jonathan Shea, because it sounds familiar, but I'm not exactly sure if I've read his work. So thank you for that. Um, yeah. So when you're working in this field as well, oftentimes you might find that the work gets a bit triggering if you have your own traumatic experiences. Or you might experience things like vicarious trauma, which is not something we go into today, but vicarious trauma is really when you have an indirect experience with traumatic stories, and then that changes your own worldview. So as a helping professional, if you're hearing other people's traumatic stories, especially over and over and over again, that can change your worldview, sometimes without even realizing it. And um, I remember I was doing this work for maybe a year, and I remember somebody saying to me, a good friend, we were just having a general conversation. They said, "Oh, like, your work has impacted you, hasn't it?" And I said, "What?" And they were like, "Well, you're talking about red flags. You're talking about this." And it wasn't something that they're used to. And I think in part that's because we get impacted, obviously, by the stories that we hear and the people that we work with. Um, yeah. So thank you for this too. Yeah. So we'll move on to the interviewing skills. Um, Okay, so as a helping professional, obviously one of the biggest pieces is to avoid behaviors and languages that may result in re-traumatizing an individual. Um, so re-traumatizing an individual, this piece is quite big. And one of the ways that we often talk about avoiding the re-traumatization is, and we will also again talk about this aspect later, but is the idea of focusing on the feelings of a traumatic event, and the goals of what's to come from a traumatic event versus the traumatic event itself. So I have been doing, let's say, I've been a trauma counselor for approximately 13 years. And but I'm not an expert, for example, in childhood sexual abuse. So if I have a client that is coming to me and talking about and opening up about childhood sexual abuse, I am going to focus on the feelings that come from that and how that impacted the individual. I'm not going to focus on the abuse itself, because what can happen is once you open that wound, so to speak, if you don't have the tools to pack that back up before finishing that conversation, before that time together ends in that moment, you can leave that individual feeling re-traumatized afterwards. And so the idea is that we avoid re-traumatizing and delving into things that we might not be prepared to delve into, that it might not be the right time, the right atmosphere, environment, the right individual to to go into that. And so when we're talking about re-traumatizing an individual, it's really important that we take care of the stories that they share, and also guiding what information gets shared and what information doesn't. Oftentimes you might hear individuals who have experienced trauma and violence in an intimate partner relationship say that they don't want to go to court because they don't want to have to retell their story. And so again, part of that retelling the story is that re-traumatization piece. So oftentimes people will say that they are re-traumatized when they have to retell the story. And so in an essence, often people will feel that they get brought back into that time and place and almost get stuck back there. And it can be very emotionally challenging and jarring. And so again, that's why the re-traumatization piece and avoiding that piece is such an important aspect when we're interviewing. So there are 4 basic ethical principles to interviewing and working with individuals with trauma. And that first piece is respect for autonomy. So that basically is the idea that we respect that everyone has different viewpoints, that they will act accordingly and voluntarily based on their beliefs, values, perspectives on things, and that they have the right to make their own choice. That choice is their right to do. And so as a helping professional, as opposed to making choices for individuals, we're really working at guiding people in certain directions to make the choices that are best for them. Beneficence, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right because I practice this word and I seem to always say it wrong. But the idea is to promote good. So really just the concept is to promote good for your client and to put your client's best interests at heart. Non-maleficence, hopefully I got that one right, is to do no harm. So again, the idea is that we avoid harm. Doing no harm is really what's at the essence of that. So we have an obligation as a helping professional to do our best to do no harm. And then justice. And so when we're working with individuals and we're thinking about justice, we're thinking about, you know, what legally, what needs to be done, what needs to be done to protect the client's rights and interests, and what is fair and balanced. And that's really what we're taking into consideration when we're talking about justice. And Jane, that's a really great point. So, sorry, Jane just said, I don't think I have the skills to pack trauma up again, would want to avoid unpacking it. And again, that's like, absolutely. And that's why we would focus on the feeling as opposed to the traumatic event itself. Because that can also be very traumatizing and potentially triggering for you as well, as a helping professional working with somebody who you might not be prepared to hear that and to unpack that, whatever experience that has on you. And so yes, absolutely, it's best to um, avoid avoid focusing on the actual event itself. So trauma-informed language, empathetic listening. So I'm just going to show this piece here. I'm going to move this so I can see it. Okay. This is just a little image of the difference between dismissive listening and empathetic listening. So when we're talking about dismissive listening, examples are, what if you try this? Or the same thing happened to my friend. And so when we're talking about, you know, the same thing happened to my friend, or I totally get it, one time, we're taking the focus away from the client and we're putting it on ourselves. And we're comparing as well and saying, you know, I totally get it because I've had a similar experience. And so this is something that we want to avoid. We want to keep the focus on the individual that we're working with. You know, saying it could be worse would come across as dismissive. You'll be fine. Don't be upset, which I think is something we say with, with just our loved ones. I was thinking, how many times have I said that to a friend? But it is something that can come across as quite dismissive. Oh, you should have read this, or listen, followed this. So when you're moving from dismissive language into empathetic language, you're moving from the idea of I want to fix you to I want to hear you. And hearing people is so much more difficult than I think we give um, than we realize. And I think being able to do that, we don't give ourselves enough credit when we are able to just empathetically listen and hear people, because it can be quite difficult. And so things that you might say to show empathetic listening would be, I'm listening. That sounds heavy. How can I show up for you moving forward? That's really important, because we're there for the client, right? We're there for the individual that we're working with. And so by being able to say, how can I show up for you? We're saying, first of all, I'm here for whatever you need, however you need that. And you're the focus, and you know what you need. You're the expert in your own life. So you tell me how to move forward. And I mean, we can also look at it as essentially also making our work a bit easier, because now we're not guessing and we're not figuring out what we have to do. We're asking and being told. I'm here is another example. Is there more? Is there anything else? Is there anything more you'd like to share? It sounds like you're saying, is that accurate? So this example of it sounds like you're saying, is that accurate, is really an example of validation and paraphrasing and restating. And that piece is really important. So by me saying, it sounds like you're saying, ... Is that accurate? I'm, first of all, I'm making sure that I'm on the right page. I'm making sure that I understand what the client is actually saying. I'm also making sure that the client feels heard, or I'm encouraging that feeling of them feeling heard. So it sounds like you're saying, they know that I've heard them, I've repeated it. And sometimes what you'll find when you use that tool of paraphrasing and restating is that you'll find sometimes the client or the individual themselves will go, actually, no, that's not what I meant. I know that's what I said, but that's not what I meant. And it can also help somebody who's got, maybe trauma and a lot going on, being able to focus their own thoughts and their own thinking and going, actually, this is what I meant to say, and this is what I'm feeling, and this is what I'm experiencing. So when we're able to restate and paraphrase, we're able to make sure that we're on the same page. We're able to show that we're hearing the individual, and we're also supporting them in making sure that their thoughts are collected, and that they're sharing with you what they actually are thinking they're sharing, or hoping that they're sharing. And so it can be a really useful, powerful tool. Being able to say, it sounds like this. Do I have this right? Does that sound accurate? Can you give me a bit more information so I can understand it a bit better? I was going into the chat. I was going to read it, but I will wait. I just want to hear all of these, what people have to say. So, and then just the last piece that to touch on there is the three, if you see the three dots in the bubble. And so what that is referring to is silence. And silence is also such an underrated tool. It is very difficult. It can be. And so oftentimes I say, that we have to start to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because silence can be a very uncomfortable experience. And I can say at the same time, I've had some of my most rewarding conversations, my most, touching conversations with individuals when I've let that silence sit. But it can be a very intense experience. I can even think of a time when it was direct eye contact and we had silence, and it was probably a minute. It felt like a lifetime, but it was probably only a minute. But that is, and then what happens is when you offer that silence, you offer the other individual time to think through and process what they want to say and what they're feeling. And also, you're not putting words in somebody's mouth. You're actually waiting to hear them and hear what they have to say. That individual can feel heard, um, and can feel as though they've got time and space. So, not feeling rushed, like they have to respond or that there's a certain response that they have to give, that it's okay to just kind of sit. And sometimes that might be exactly what someone needs, is just somebody to sit with them while they think through things, and then eventually be able to talk about what's going on. So silence, I'm not sure. I would be really interested after the break to hear people's thoughts on silence, and if that's something that you use in your work, and how that looks for you in terms of working with individuals, and how difficult that can be, how difficult it can be to get comfortable being uncomfortable as well. So active listening is another aspect to trauma-informed care and language that is quite important, and there's so many aspects to active listening. When you're looking through this image here, if you can just replace student with client, that would be best, or individual. So some of these things we've kind of gone through as well. But first, paraphrasing, and we did touch on this. So the idea that we're paraphrasing what somebody said. I hear you saying this. Does that sound right? Does that sound accurate? Am I on the right page here? So being able to paraphrase to make sure that you understand, and to help the individual gather their thoughts and understand as well what's going on for them. Asking questions. Um, and so this is to encourage somebody to elaborate on thoughts and feelings. And what's significant about asking questions too is asking open-ended versus closed-ended questions. And I'm sure people know those terms already, but the idea is that you're asking questions. Open-ended questions are giving you the opportunity to hear more than a yes or no response. So closed questions, you might ask, like, do you enjoy reading? Yes. Because you enjoy reading, is that something you do often? Yes. That will get me a different response than, what do you like to do on your free time? Like, what is something that you often do when you just get time to yourself? Reading might come out of that, but then there might be 5 other things that come from that I can then pull off of. And so the open-ended questions can be really significant for gathering information, and for having a better understanding of the individual that you're supporting. Positive body language. So I'd love for people to also practice maybe with a loved one. So what it's found that oftentimes we mimic the body language of the individual that we're talking to. And so if somebody, I mean, just if you ever want to practice, just talk to somebody and cross your arms and see how long it takes for the person that you're talking to then cross their arms as well. And you'll find that oftentimes we start to mimic the body language of the individual that we're talking to. So positive body language, ideally, is that we wouldn't sit directly in front of somebody. Ideally, that could be considered adversarial, especially when somebody's going through trauma. And it could be considered somewhat institutional, like I sit across from my doctor, I sit across from my teacher, I sit across from this medical professional. It can feel a bit institutional and adversarial. So oftentimes we suggest that there's just a bit of a turn. It's not much, but just something, and that your body is open. And so, that might mean you're not having your fists closed, because that can seem adversarial, but your hands are open. You're facing the individual, but maybe not directly on. That's also for safety reasons. You might not have to come across that aspect, but if you do, for safety reasons, It can also be better to be a bit off to the side so that you have the option to move if you need to, a bit easier away from somebody. So it's suggested that, again, open positive body language. You know, if I'm sitting like this while you're talking, it's probably going to be a very different experience than if I'm sitting like this while you're talking. And so that is just something to keep in mind when you're working with individuals. And I don't know how many people are doing interviews over Zoom, which can make things a bit more difficult in terms of body language and showing body language. And I applaud people for that, because I think that adds another layer of difficulty when we're having to do these when we're having to do this work in a virtual setting. But as best as you can, obviously, positive body language is important. Showing empathy, so validating how someone is feeling. That sounds awful. I hear what you're saying, and that sounds like it was a really difficult experience for you. I can't imagine. Showing that empathy of putting yourself in someone's shoes, but not directly stating, oh, like if that was me, but just showing that empathy of, that sounds like a really difficult situation that you were in. Do you want to talk more about that? How did you overcome that? And again, looking at the strength-based piece when we're talking about how did you overcome, we're looking at the positive. Avoiding judgment. I think it's safe to say that no one likes to talk to somebody that you feel is judging you. And we can say that probably in our own personal lives as well, how difficult it is to have an open conversation with someone that you feel is judging you. And so that piece is really important, to understand that you're going to have a different perspective, that we're going to go into things with our own biases as well, and to try to be mindful of that, and to try not to put our own perspectives and beliefs onto someone else, and be open to differences, different perspectives, different beliefs, different experiences. Don't give advice too quickly, for many reasons. First of all, the more information that you can gather, the better advice you can give. So rather than giving advice and them saying, well, no, that's not what I meant, or that won't help me because of this. If you give more time to understand what the person's needs are, then you will have a better opportunity to give stronger advice. Also, someone might not need advice, and so they might not be looking for advice. They might already have the answer that they need. They might just need to talk it through. And so you might not even need to do that extra step either. And then also, it can make someone feel, if you're interrupting someone to give advice, it can make someone feel that they're not being heard. And so because that piece is so important, feeling heard, taking time before we give advice or guide somebody into a different direction or a new direction, it's important to give that time that's needed. Evaluate the conversation. So after you've taken in what they've said, take some time just to evaluate what are the next steps that you think are important, and what are the next steps that the individual you're working with thinks are important. It might even be evaluating the conversation in terms of processing everything that's coming through. And so I would say, allow yourself to take breaks. Oftentimes we say, does the person we're supporting need a break? But there's at least two people involved in an interview. And so you yourself might need a break, and that's okay. And that is something that is healthy. It's healthy to take breaks when we need them, right? So it might even be, I've heard what you've said and I'm just taking it all in. Do you mind if we just take a 5-minute break to grab something to drink? And then we can come back and continue. And the individual themselves might be happy, because they might be looking forward to that break as well. It can be very exhausting talking about trauma. It can be very exhausting talking about pain, let alone traumatic pain. So it can work well for both of you or all of you. And listening may be enough. So again, we might be tempted to fix people or fix a problem. And at times, people are just looking for someone to listen. And again, this is something that, in my own life, it's a challenge that I've had, is this idea of trying to fix and come up with a solution. And I think as helping professionals, we oftentimes automatically want to find a solution for people and to support people in what they need to move forward. And that moment might not be the moment that is right for them to move forward. It might not be the time that they need to have ideas on or solutions. So sometimes listening may just be enough, and a lot. And so don't underestimate the significance of listening and just being there for somebody to talk. Strength-based practice, another important piece that I believe we've also talked about. So this is the idea that we're focusing on somebody's strengths, as opposed to their shortcomings and their failures. So we're going to identify strengths and build on them. So, you're telling me that you're feeling, it's you're feeling really difficult. This is really difficult for you to find employment. But you did mention that you worked, at Best Buy in the past. How was it that you overcame that difficulty then? Like, what did that look like for you back then? And how did that play out for you? And so what we're doing is we're focusing on, well, you did do this before. You were able to do this before. You do have the tools. You do have the strengths. How? What did those look like for you? Because they're going to look different for everybody. So somebody might say, well, I at that point, like, I decided I would, talk to somebody that was there and try to build a rapport with them, and then they offered me a position, where somebody else might say, like, I went to my employment skills advocate and they assisted me in finding. And so then you can build on that and go, oh, well, that's fantastic. That worked for you in the past. How do you feel about approaching that person again this time? And so again, instead of trying to search in the dark for all these answers, we're finding out from the individual what's worked for them before, what their strengths are, and then we're pulling on that to build on those strengths, and as opposed to focusing on deficits. And that empowers people to move forward and to see their own strengths, because oftentimes we're our own worst critic. So I think that's across the board, probably for most. We're our own worst critic, and so oftentimes we forget our strengths, or we forget the resiliency and what we've been able to overcome. So sometimes it's just those reminders that, you've been here before and you're very resilient and you're here again, but what got you out of this position before? Or you've been in a different position, but it's been a challenge. You've had a different challenge before. How did you overcome that challenge? Oh, you used this. Oh, like, what was useful for you? What worked for you? And you'll find that people can start to remember what worked for them, and also draw upon their own solutions as well, which is really important. So strength-based approach can be really, really useful and beneficial for working with individuals, especially experiencing trauma. So just a few, I hate putting do's and don'ts, but just a few do's and don'ts. So try not to minimize what a person is saying. Try not to minimize how a person is feeling. Again, we all experience trauma differently. And so it's not beneficial, I think, to the helping relationship, to minimize what somebody is going through. And then that will impact them feeling heard. So try not to minimize, and try not to overshare. So if somebody's talking to me about the struggles of, being a single mom and finances and that, and I might go, you know what, I understand, as a single mom, it can be really difficult to balance your time and your finances. And I hear that. I know how that feels. And is there something that you've done in the past that has helped being able to manage your time better versus I know how difficult it is to be a single mom. Like my kids, their dad used to abuse them, and now I'm paying for counseling, and there's a lot of trauma there. And, I don't get paid enough to be able to afford everything that I have to do with my kids and with their counseling and with after school care. So I completely understand, what you're saying. Those are very different examples. So I can give information. I can say, what you're saying resonates with me, and I can relate without oversharing and giving information that's unnecessary. So the second example, if I'm starting to talk about, I know how difficult it is, my kids are going through this, I'm going through this. I'm now giving information that's not helping the individual. It's focusing the attention on me instead of on the person I'm supporting, and it's crossing boundaries that may be also unethical. And so it's important that we can relate and we can have information that resonates, but we have to be mindful not to overshare personal information about ourselves, which can be difficult when you're trying to build a rapport. That said, I would say you're human and there's nothing wrong with sharing some information. But again, it's the information that's important that will be beneficial to the person you're supporting. And then that's where it needs to end. Cause harm, obviously. Do not cause harm as best as you can. Disclose confidential information to anyone who is not obliged to know. This piece is really important. So it's important because we're dealing with such sensitive information that we avoid breaching confidentiality. And so if, for example, you have a colleague that's working with the same individual and this information is important for them to know, then you will share this information because they're involved in the case and this information helps them work with the client as well. And you would most likely disclose to the client who would be privy to this information as well. I'm not going to talk to my family members, my friends about confidential information about something that someone's disclosed to me. If I do need to talk about something, what I'm going to do about an experience I've had with a client, what I would do is I would remove any identifying factors. So I'm not going to necessarily talk about age, race, potentially gender or sexual orientation. I'm going to remove any identifying factors that I can so that that person can remain and their case can remain as confidential as possible. And that's with people who maybe I need to share some information with, but not all information with. But again, it's important that people's information remains confidential and that we're not sharing this because that then becomes a breach. And we want to avoid breaching confidentiality as much as possible. And obviously, lastly, do not take your work home with you. And of course, like that's easier said than done, right? and I'm sure many people, many a time, have gone home and said, "Where's the wine?" or "Where's the cake?" or "Where's something?" But it's really and again, I think we've all done it. I can think of my first few months working in this field and working with trauma survivors and people in the midst of trauma and crisis, and going home on Christmas Eve and opening up gifts and just starting to sob, and my family being like, "What is happening right now?" And it's hard. It can be really hard not to take your work home with you. I mean, sometimes people have nightmares. It's difficult. I've heard of people pulling over and just throwing up because of the what they've taken in and taken with them from work. So obviously, I mean, I think we hear the term self-care so much that it's almost meaningless, but we do need to take time for ourselves, take time out for ourselves, and we need to, as best we can, not take the work home with us. Because if we come into work with a cup half empty, that's not going to help anyone anyway. And so, and any solutions, any efforts you can make to avoid taking work home with you, um, is obviously ideal and something to work towards. Um, sorry, just going back to taking work home with you. One last thing, I have a colleague who, she does almost like a ritual every time she walks into work and every time she leaves work, and this is her way of trying not to take work home with her. So she will come into work and she will, I forget what she does, but she does something like knocking on a tree, saying something next to a tree, and then she goes into the office. When she leaves, there's a tree outside of the office. She does the exact same thing, and then she goes home. And for her, that's her way of saying, look, like what I'm doing is here, it's in here, is staying in here, and now I'm going home, and this is separate. So everybody has their own thing. Some people say, if I put certain music on the drive home, that helps me get release some of that. But just a couple examples what that could look like. Do validate, actively listen, we've gone through, paraphrase to confirm accuracy, to help the person feel that they're being heard, empathize, and people, I'm sure again, people know this, you've all worked with so many different clients and diverse clients, but people can tell when you're genuine and when you're not. So I think that's an important piece to keep in mind, that empathy is not about performance. And so it's something, and we might not empathize with someone every single time or every single day. We're also human. And so we have our days and our limitations. But people can generally pick up on when someone is being genuine or sincere and feeling that. And so as best we can to work on being able to empathize with somebody is really, really important and beneficial to creating that rapport and relationship. Asking open-ended questions again, acknowledging the client's expertise. So again, the client is the expert in their own life. They will have better tools or better solutions, I should say, better ideas of what they're experiencing than I will, than anyone else that isn't them will. And so it's always best to be able to acknowledge, recognize, and pull on your client's expertise, on what works for them, what they're experiencing, what they're feeling. Build rapport and trust. Obviously, that piece is very important. The stronger rapport and trust that we build, the more we'll get from the helping relationship. Both individuals, as the helping professional and as the individual seeking support. Offering breaks, again, can be really beneficial for the helping professional as well as for the person seeking support. Even if it's just to kind of process what's going on. It can be really beneficial being able to just have a drink. Some people need to go out and have a smoke, and that's what calms them so that they can come back in, because again, it can be really, really difficult sharing traumatic stories and hearing them. And so people will have different ways that they need to release some of that tension or energy. Being as transparent as possible. That piece I find is really, really important, especially when building trust, to be as transparent as possible. That might mean sharing, like, these are the steps that I have to take. These are the steps that I'm doing. This is what the next steps are going to look like. This is where your information goes. This is who gets to see your information. These are all important and can show that transparency, and also at least a willingness to be transparent, which can also help with building that trust. Embrace a culturally responsive approach. So when possible, this can be really beneficial. So if someone smudges before they want to begin talking about trauma, because that releases and offers protection for them, then smudging might be something that that you're able to offer. If somebody prays, and doesn't mean that you're necessarily a religious person yourself, but maybe you can offer them space to do that if they need to do that at the beginning or at the end of a session. So being able to embrace culturally responsive approaches can be really, really important, because oftentimes we work in a very white Western colonial lens, and the things that we do are very much colonial in nature. And so it can be really beneficial when we can offer other approaches um, to when we're working with clients. And they might seem minor, but for someone else, they might show at least that there's an effort being made as well. Um, Focus on feelings and goals as opposed to the traumatic event itself. I feel like I've said this so many times, but it's so important to focus again on how somebody's feeling, focus on the goals of what they want to come from your meeting. You might already have established that might already be there. So it might even just be restating those. But avoiding focusing on the traumatic event itself as much as possible. Recognize and acknowledge that you will not have all the answers and are not expected to. I don't know anyone. I've worked with individuals that have worked with this in the field for 30 years, and they do not have all the answers every time. No one will have all the answers all the time. And I think, again, sometimes we're all our own worst critics, and we expect that we should know, we should always know, we should always be able to give somebody the response that they're looking for and that they need. And it just might be that this is something we need to look into. And there's no shame in saying, you know what, I'm actually not sure, but that's something that I'll look into and I'll get back to you on it. And I find that people also respect that transparency and that honesty, that you don't know and that we aren't expected to know everything. Reflect on personal impact of hearing traumatic stories. So again, going back to the not taking work home with you, we are impacted by the stories that we hear, and we can very much be impacted by indirect trauma. Again, that can be referred to, it's often referred to as vicarious trauma, where indirect trauma impacts our worldview. And so, for example, what you'll sometimes see with helping professionals who work in the area of intimate partner violence and family violence, because we find research shows that most violence, intimate partner violence, the perpetrator is male. This is definitely not always, certainly not. And of course, not every relationship that we're looking at is heterosexual either. But there is research to show that oftentimes in intimate partner violence and family violence, men are the perpetrators of violence. And so what you will see a lot of the times when you have helping professionals that work in this field for a long period, there's a skewed perception of men, of males, of relationships, of expectations of relationships. And it's difficult. It's difficult to not allow traumatic stories to then impact you indirectly. It's a very hard thing to do. And so often reflecting on, so this is staying with me. Why is this staying with me? Why is this story staying with me? Why do I feel that this story is impacting me? What is it about it? And starting to ask yourself questions and reflect on that to understand what the root is of that, to try to avoid as much as possible feeling those those experiences, such as like vicarious trauma, for example. Set boundaries, but be human. So you'll see the image on these slides is a heart. And the reason why the image is a heart is because I was in a webinar myself not that long ago, and I found it really interesting. The facilitator was talking about the concept of love and how love has become almost this very scary, very like you stay away from this concept in terms of the helping profession. And so I think what was interesting was this idea of talking about that love is not something that we have to avoid in terms of helping professional. We can have love for humanity. We can have love for supporting people through crises and through trauma. Love doesn't necessarily have to be just intimate partner intimacy. It can look so many ways, obviously, as we know. And so, there's important to be able to have that care for another person, but also being able to set boundaries. So I might have care for someone that I'm working with, but I also know that I'm not going to have an intimate relationship with that person because that would be unethical. And so those boundaries need to be set. Um, I'm not going to start communicating with a client at, let's say, midnight and 1 in the morning, because I know that that would be considered inappropriate. And so I'm going to still have those boundaries in place. So again, it's important to have boundaries, but also to be human. um, and that we also don't need to be robotic either. We can be human, we can show care, we can show love, we can show compassion while also setting those boundaries as well. um, Adhering to a duty to report when obliged, and we'll go through what a duty to report is, but that is also important, is that when there is a duty to report, and you are obliged to follow that, then that you adhere to it. And offering resources. So obviously, oftentimes we are not the first person that somebody's going to be in contact with, and we won't be the last in terms of service providers. So being able to offer those resources and making some of those transitions more seamless can be really beneficial. Okay, so um, oh, there's so many things in the chat, but I will look at those in a moment. So we will go into the breakout rooms if people would humor me. I would very much appreciate it. And we'll do some discussion and technique. So sort of mock interviews. So the breakout room should have about, let's say, about 4 people, depending on how many people are in the session. And the idea is that if everybody can just have an opportunity to practice interviewing. So somebody will share stories, a story, or go through the interview process, and the interviewer will take an approach that is trauma informed, strength based, and try to use active listening and empathetic listening. Just a few minutes, and then switch off so that the next person gets to try using those, and then we'll come back and discuss and reflect. So again, the idea is we're going to have somebody who will talk about a story, something that doesn't have to be very detailed, but go into, if you were in an interview, what is something you've heard in the past? What is something that maybe a student or a client has said to you that in a session when you've been talking, and how would you want to work through that? So use those as examples, and then try to go through with a trauma-informed, strength-based, active listening, empathetic listening. That's all, just all of that stuff, right? As much as possible. Obviously, there's a lot there. And just to try to get like a bit of a feel for, and you might find, oh, this is stuff that I do already. This is nothing new. I just didn't realize maybe I was doing it. Or no, I knew I was doing this. I'm very I've been doing this very consciously, and this is not new for me. Or maybe this is very new, and some of these things I haven't done yet. And so we'll discuss and reflect afterward. And if you can't participate in the breakout room, maybe what you could do is you could at least just be there to kind of be a part and see what's happening. So if you can't necessarily be somebody who's practicing the interview, because let's say you don't have audio, maybe you can even be a part of it. And in the discussion and reflection piece, you could write in the chat. That's also an option if people are comfortable with that. So probably we'll just do 10 minutes. It won't be long. And after that, we'll come back, have a little discussion, and then take a break. So I'm just gonna put people into the breakout rooms now, if I can. So I believe, let me look here. We have probably 12 breakout rooms. And then I'm just going to let them, let Zoom kind of assign them automatically. And they should be open. And so again, we'll just come back in about 10 minutes. I'll close them at that point.
Hello.
Hello?
So, I was recording this webinar, so I'm not sure if it will just record this portion.
Oh,
I'm always a speaker whenever I do this, and it's interesting. It would be interesting to know if it's actually recording just this piece of the breakout room, unless I can just pause it, but I'm not sure what will happen. I don't know, I'll just pause the recording.
I was able to pop into the rooms just to make sure that everybody was in a room where they could participate. And it was interesting to hear some of the techniques. Like I heard somebody talking about breathing and deep breathing, and I thought that's such a great technique as well. I think everyone or most people are back. Of course, I've talked too much and now we don't have a lot of time. So if it's okay, we'll take a 10-minute break instead of a 15. And if it's also okay, because we're so close to the end, maybe we could just save questions and comments to the very end, if people are comfortable with that. So I can try to run through the last slides. But the interviewing skills piece, I think, was the aspect that needed the most attention. So hopefully we can get through the other ones quicker. So I'm just going to 10-minute break. If we can come back at 10:46, that would be lovely. Thank you. Reality and limitations. So this is confidentiality is the principle of keeping secure and secret from others information given by or about an individual in the course of a professional relationship. And it is the right of every patient, even after death. So confidentiality is quite a big piece. And it's something that is really important in terms of when we're taking information, secure information, especially from individuals that would be vulnerable and would have this information shared with others. Limits to confidentiality are what we refer to as a duty to report. So this is when there's disclosure of self-harm in terms of suicidal ideations. Now, if somebody's disclosing self-harm, but it's not in reference to suicidal ideation, that is not a duty to report. It's when it becomes an issue of whether or not that person is going to harm themselves. So that's really the idea. Are they going to harm themselves in terms of, could it be something such as a major injury or death? So some people will do surface level cutting as a form of self-harm, but that's not something that you would have to report on. If somebody's talking suicide, and this is also something that you could get into with more details, but you would want to know if there was a plan, and then that's how you would know whether or not that's something that you would need to report. If there is a plan, then that would be something to report. disclosure of harm to others, disclosure of harm to children or minors, or if you're being subpoenaed. So those are the times when there's confidentiality can be breached. So it's important to make the person aware of and get their consent to the duty to report, so that they know that if you disclose such and such, that I will have a duty to report. And oftentimes it's best if you can do that prior to having a discussion with an individual. So for example, prior to, let's say, an interview. Also, if you do need to make, let's say, for example, a call to CAS, it's always beneficial if you can have the client that you're supporting there with you when you make that call. I need to make this call because of this duty to report, but I would appreciate if you would be here with me to make that call together. So that's a really important piece to offer someone. Documentation do's and don'ts. So effective and ethical documentation is essential when working with vulnerable populations and the general public. It is necessary to share essential information with other service providers in an effective and ethical way. And so what we document is really important, and how we document is really important. So documentation is a tool that can be used to review what kind of service the client has received, what kind of services the client may need to be connected to and referred to, and it can keep everyone who's working with that client in the same organization on the same page. Ethical documentation requires an understanding and respect for an individual's right to confidentiality and privacy. We won't really go through these, but the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Federal Privacy Act all protect individuals' rights to privacy. And so that's another piece as to why a confidentiality aspect is such an important one. So documentation do's and don'ts. Document while information is still fresh in your mind, so as soon as possible, essentially. Provide concise and relevant information, limit irrelevant details. Those are not needed. So be mindful of biases. So when we're documenting, it's important that it be in a neutral tone, so that we're mindful of those biases, and that we're only documenting on relevant information. What is needed for that other, let's say, service provider to know? Do they need to know, for example, that my client self-harms? Probably not. That's not necessarily a relevant piece of information. That is something that you would keep confidential. Do they need to know that my client has accessibility needs? That would be a relevant piece of information that you would want to share with somebody. Review the tone and pay attention to the tone of notes. Sorry. Is it neutral and factual? That's what it needs to be. So when we're writing notes, we need the tone to be neutral and factual. If it's subjective and interpretive, we need to revise those notes. So again, it's important that when we're documenting, that notes are neutral and factual. Document notes in the third person. So writer, this writer, staff, this staff. So instead of saying I in the first person, we're going to document notes in the third person. And then remember, clients have a legal right to access a copy of notes. And I'm not sure that everyone is aware of that piece, but they do have, people do have a legal right to access a copy of their notes when they're working with helping professionals. And so keep that in mind when you're writing notes. And also the concept of do no harm. And then this is, I believe this is ending off on this piece. A quote, when I think notes, I think legacy. How do I want to be remembered by my colleagues and clients who may have access to these notes? I want to be known as professional, knowledgeable, ethical, thorough, and kind. I think that's a really a good way to look at notes and note writing. That because anybody can review these can be subpoenaed, clients can get access to these, that you would want these to be professional, knowledgeable, ethical, thorough, and kind. And then documentation, discussion, and reflection. So I guess we'll do all of the discussion and reflection together at once. Consider information you've documented previously. Upon reflection, would you change how you document information? How might you document differently? So we have 7 minutes, but we can stay an extra few minutes for anybody who's available, to just kind of, if we can, go through people's experiences with the breakout room, and any questions or feedback, comments people have in general. And for those who are interested, this will be posted, and the additional resources will be available as well. Yeah, so I'm just going to stop share so it's the larger group again. But any thoughts on your experience in the breakout room, for example, and practicing those interviewing skills? Did they feel familiar already? Things that you've already done? Were there things that were new? Jeremy, yes.
So while you were talking earlier, I was thinking about an experience that I had that had to happen via Zoom because it was during one of the lockdowns, and I thought it fit very nicely into the type of empathetic interviewing that you were talking about. So I had experience with a client about 1.5 years ago who revealed to me, when we were talking about where he wanted to go with his career, that he had in the last few months lost his 6-year-old daughter. And it happened via Zoom, and I realized right away, because I immediately felt something and felt for him, but I realized I also had the added responsibility of trying to figure out, well, how do I convey the authenticity of my emotions, not just through what I say, but also through my visual, through how I was presenting myself via Zoom. So when we were in our breakout room, we were talking about, what kind of a scenario can we do? And will somebody be the interviewer and the interviewee? And I thought, you know what, if everyone in the group is fine with it, I want to put myself in the situation of the interviewee to actually see what I took away from that conversation that I had in the late winter last year. And it was, and what was really sensitive about it was I have a daughter who's about the same age as the person who lost their child. And so I was really trying to put myself in that situation. And I felt that personally that helped me where the exercise was concerned, because it seems to me that, like you were discussing, that's what empathy really is about, is can you actually place yourself or attempt, I should say, to place yourself in that other person's situation, whether you have similarities to them or not, just to try to occupy or attempt to occupy their mental and emotional space. And so that's what I brought to that. And I found personally that was a challenge, but that it was a beneficial one, because I haven't done that before. I've always been in the interviewer position, not the interviewee position. And so that's what I did. And I'm glad that I had an opportunity to do it. So I thought I would share that.
And Jeremy, that's such a great piece too, to think about. What was there a difference between being the interviewer versus the interviewee, and did people experience that differently? Was it what you would expect being the person that's being interviewed? Yeah, and also touching on how difficult it is to navigate that sort of information, those sort of traumatic stories via Zoom. A very difficult space to navigate that. Thank you for sharing. Any other experiences in the breakout room?
Well, I could share. Or else somebody else already is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sue. Oh, sorry. Was Sue first, and after is Alicia? Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah. So in our breakout room, a couple of things surfaced. One was the fact that the increasing amount of trauma that we have to deal with in our students and people who approach us. It's difficult in that it takes us away from our core purpose, and we have to try to navigate how do we devote our energies. We want to help the people that experience trauma, but at the same time, it takes us away from teaching and from the literacy activities that we're supposed to be doing. The other thing is making decisions around intake when we have people who have been severely traumatized, and we know that can really affect ability to learn, ability to memorize, ability to focus on studies. How do we make intake decisions with somebody who has experienced trauma? How to serve them in terms of a literacy program?
So that's a fantastic question. And that is something I'd like to look into that a bit more and maybe come back to you on that. You're absolutely right. And when you study the brain and effects of trauma on the brain, you see that exactly as you said, attention to detail, focus can become really difficult. So then and when you're trying to decipher somebody's literacy skills, that aspect is vital to understand and know. And so and the thing with trauma too is that it can also differ depending on the state you're in. So if you're in in a moment where you're experiencing a crisis, or you're experiencing disassociation or something, you are going to have your brain is going to be also, it's going to look at that literacy document, let's say, differently than if you're at a place where maybe you're feeling more grounded and secure. So that is a fantastic question. It's one that I'd like to come back to, and maybe I can offer some resources to Carolina that she can share, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue.
The next is Alicia, and then after is Joan.
So it's just a quick comment that we had from our breakout room, which is that we found it interesting that all of us are from, literacy or employment, but yet we all, excuse me, we all have the need for this type of a webinar or workshop. And that's kind of showing us that sometimes the healthcare system is a whole separate story, but there isn't sometimes somewhere for people to access mental health support, let alone somewhere to tell their story. And so we're finding that sometimes just a quick question of, so what brings you in? Or, how has learning been for you? And it just starts. Because sometimes we're that friendly person, or we're a place that's safe for them to explain. And it's very flattering as a provider to make sure that they feel safe, obviously, that they can do that. But also it comes with us having to sometimes boundary put and say, I'm so glad you're feeling safe to share, but at the same time, I want to make sure you get the professional support that you need, because sometimes it's above what we're able to offer. So we were kind of talking about the line that you have to find, and it doesn't always show itself so clearly. That's kind of what we are finding.
Alicia, I would say absolutely. And you can be doing the work for so long and still find difficulty in being able to close up a conversation that is very meaningful for that person, right? And when you see that emotion, it's very hard to go, well, I don't have time for that right now. And how do you do that in a way that feels good for everybody? And something that often, we can offer is referrals to crisis lines. And so I can share a couple of those as well. But you're right, in that moment when somebody wants to talk and they want to talk to you and they see you as somebody that they feel comfortable sharing, it's a big ask, it's a big responsibility. And someone was talking about how it takes you away from your other work. So this might not even be the area that you really work in, and you're expected to take on this role of counselor or supporter. That's a lot to ask, right? That's a heavy load to bear. And then on top of that, being able to do that in a way that feels good for both you and the person that you're supporting. And I would say, what you said sounds, first of all, fantastic. Being able to validate, thank you for sharing that with me. That must have been really difficult to share. And I thank you for trusting me to share that with me. And right now in this moment, I wish we could discuss this more. I don't have the opportunity right now. Maybe we can schedule a time where you can come back and you can meet with somebody, or maybe I can help you get connected with this resource. Very difficult situation to navigate. Thank you for sharing that, Alicia.
Okay. Sorry. Next is Joan. Yeah, I was looking for you.
Yeah, no worries. I think we all work in the literacy field. We're all working with people that have multiple barriers, and trauma certainly is one of them. I just wanted to share, we tend to have really good boundaries with the adults we work with, but we do establish a relationship with them, and we are big supporters, and they do look at us for advice or support. And the one thing I experienced when COVID hit, and we were talking about self-care and not answering the phone and all those answers, when couple of my folks that have suffered some severe trauma, I would answer the phone at midnight. Everybody was isolated. On top of the trauma, now they are struggling with that isolation. But I found now it's difficult to get back in now that we're opened up. So if anybody has any suggestions how to, we supported them through some pretty bouts of isolation, and I would just like try to figure out how to get back into those boundaries again.
Yeah, that's a really difficult one. It's so hard because I mean, I'm sure as you know, and has and anyone with children also knows, like what you have to start off with the boundary. It's very hard to come back to that later, implement it later. So you're absolutely right. And I think maybe that's when a candid discussion, that's when being just completely transparent. It was like I was so honored to be able to work with you at any time, day or night, when other resources weren't open. Now that other resources are open, unfortunately, my hours have to go back to, 9 to 5, whatever it looks like. And I am there for you during those hours at any point. After that, you can contact this resource going forward. But I'm certainly there for you during this time. Just now with the changes, I need to move back to these hours. I would do it in a way, and I mean, I'm sure you have your own way of doing it as well, but just kind and honest, because sometimes I think people can read through the lines too a bit and know, and I think what you're asking for too is reasonable. And sometimes we want to do more, we want to do so much for people as well, but it's reasonable for somebody to go, that makes sense. Like somebody can only be there for this period of time. So hopefully they would be able to meet you meet you on that one.